Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. So if you lock your extended knees and parachute to the ground at like 20 feet per second, the deceleration force traveling up your skeletal axis is it's identical to jumping off a 6-foot wall with no parachute at all.
Yeah, which is just brutal.
Right. You can literally shatter your pelvis in an instant. Welcome to the deep dive. Whether you're a medical student furiously cramming for your physiology block, or you're just, insanely curious about what happens to the human machine when you push it to the absolute edge of the atmosphere, you are in the right place.
You definitely are.
Today, our mission is to explore the extremes, diving into the material from Chapter 44 of the Guyton and Hall textbook of Medical Physiology, 15th edition. We are looking at high-altitude hypoxia, the crushing acceleration of aviation, and the silent microgravity of space.
And we aren't just going to list off a bunch of random symptoms for you. We are going to track the actual physical journey of the human body. So leaving sea level, climbing to the highest peaks, strapping into a fighter jet, and eventually launching into orbit.
Following the exact logical chain of the textbook.
Exactly. We'll look at the brutal physics of the environment, how our anatomical structures support function, how that function is regulated, and how the whole integrated system either desperately compensates to keep you alive or, well, critically fails.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the physical boundary, which is atmospheric pressure. Down here at sea level, barometric pressure sits at a very comfortable 760 millimeters of mercury.
Right, but if you take a jet up to, say, 50,000 feet, that ambient pressure plummets to just 87 millimeters of mercury.
Wow, that's a massive drop.
It is, and that drop is the fundamental trigger for almost every high-altitude crisis. Because as the total barometric pressure drops, the partial pressure of atmospheric oxygen drops right along with it.
But it actually gets exponentially worse once that ambient air enters your respiratory tract, right?
It does, because inside your alveoli, oxygen is not the only gas in the room. Your body is constantly dumping carbon dioxide into the lungs to exhale it.
Plus the water vapor.
Right. The fluid lining your respiratory tract vaporizes, and that maintains a constant water vapor pressure of exactly 47 millimeters of mercury, assuming normal body temperature.
Okay, so imagine the space inside your alveoli is like a suitcase with a strict, non-negotiable weight limit. The carbon dioxide and the water vapor are mandatory items. They're like heavy snow boots and a massive winter coat that you absolutely must pack.
I love that visual because those physiological gases do not compress. They claim their absolute pressure regardless of what's happening outside.
So as you climb higher and the barometric pressure drops, that suitcase is physically shrinking. And those heavy boots take up an overwhelmingly massive percentage of the available room, basically evicting the oxygen you're trying to pack.
Precisely. It's just simple displacement, and you can actually track this displacement in the textbook's data. If you look at Table 44.1 and Figure 44.1, they map out a pilot's arterial oxygen saturation.
Oh, right, the graph of the two curves.
Yeah, so the blue curve tracks a pilot breathing normal atmospheric air. They stay perfectly fine, maintaining over 90% saturation up until about 10,000 feet. But cross that altitude and saturation just falls off an absolute cliff.
Dropping to like 70% at 20,000 feet.
Yeah, exactly. But the second curve, the red one, tracks a pilot breathing 100% pure oxygen, and that shifts the whole timeline way to the right.
Because breathing pure oxygen is essentially kicking all the useless atmospheric nitrogen out of our imaginary suitcase.
Right. You are filling every single millimeter of leftover alveolar pressure with pure O2. So a pilot breathing normal air has a functional ceiling of about 23,000 feet before they slip into a coma. But on pure oxygen, that ceiling skyrockets to 47,000 feet.
What happens right before that coma, though? Like if I'm at 15,000 feet without acclimatizing, how fast does my brain shut down?
Shockingly fast, honestly. At 15,000 feet, your mental proficiency, so your judgment, memory, fine motor skills, drops to 50% of normal within a single hour. You get drowsy, confused, and dangerously overconfident.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and push higher to 18,000 feet, you start seeing neurological misfires leading to seizures.
Which means the body has to scramble to adapt if we don't descend. So let's trace that acclimatization cascade. The second I step off a helicopter onto a mountain peak, what is the very first thing my body does?
The immediate first responder is your ventilation. You have these arterial chemoreceptors primarily in the carotid bodies in your neck, and they instantly detect plummeting oxygen. They fire rapid signals to the respiratory center in your brainstem,
which forcefully boosts the breathing rate.
Exactly. Within minutes, your pulmonary ventilation spikes to about 1.65 times normal.
So heavy, rapid breathing, which sure gets more oxygen in, but you're also blowing off huge quantities of carbon dioxide.
Right, and here is where the physiological conflict begins. Carbon dioxide travels through the blood primarily as carbonic acid. When you hyperventilate and blow off all that CO2, you are venting acid from your bloodstream,
shifting the blood chemistry into respiratory alkalosis.
Yes, the pH spikes. And the respiratory center in your brainstem is incredibly sensitive to pH. When it senses that extreme alkalosis, it essentially panics. It sends inhibitory signals saying, hey, stop breathing so fast, we are losing our acid base.
Wait, if the initial rapid breathing actually causes an alkaline imbalance that stops us from breathing more, isn't that like a physiological design flaw?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it looks like a flaw until you realize the respiratory system isn't working alone. The lungs can't fix this chemical gridlock, so over the next 2 to 5 days, your kidneys step up.
Oh, the renal system rides to the rescue.
Exactly. The kidneys detect the low CO2 and high pH, and they actively begin excreting bicarbonate, which is a potent base, right into your urine.
So they're dumping base to counteract the fact that we blew off all our acid.
You got it. By dumping bicarbonate, the kidneys manually force the pH of the blood and the cerebrospinal fluid back down to a normal, slightly acidic baseline.
And then the brainstem stops panicking.
Yes. The inhibitory braking mechanism shuts off, and suddenly your ventilation can ramp up from that initial 1.65 times normal to an incredible 5 times normal.
That is wild. The kidneys literally adjust the chemical bath of the brain, so the lungs have permission to do their job.
It's a beautiful integrated system. And while that's happening, your cardiovascular system undergoes a massive structural shift. Hypoxia stimulates the bone marrow to produce red blood cells at a staggering rate. Your hematocrit, the percentage of blood volume made up of red cells, jumps from a normal 40% to around 60%.
And the lungs physically change how they handle blood flow too, right?
Yeah.
The diffusing capacity, like the actual surface area available to absorb oxygen, can triple.
Because at sea level, your pulmonary blood pressure isn't high enough to push blood all the way to the top of your lungs. Those upper capillaries are just collapsed. But hypoxia triggers pulmonary hypertension. The blood pressure rises, forcing blood up into those dormant capillaries, recruiting massive amounts of new surface area.
Okay, but how does a random cell in your leg muscle actually know it's in a hypoxic state? How does it signal the body to build more red blood cells? There has to be a switch.
There is, and it operates at the DNA level. It centers around proteins called hypoxia-inducible factors, or HIFs. They act as a genetic master switch, and the brilliant part is your cells are constantly producing these HIF proteins all the time.
Wait, if they're constantly produced, why aren't my cells constantly triggering a panic response?
Because as long as oxygen is plentiful, specific enzymes called HIF hydroxylases act like a cellular cleanup crew. They immediately hunt down and destroy the HIF proteins the second they are made.
Oh, so it's a constant cycle of creation and destruction. But in hypoxia, those destroying enzymes are neutralized because they require oxygen to function.
Exactly. So without oxygen to fuel the cleanup crew, the HIF proteins survive. They accumulate and bind to your DNA, flipping that master switch. This releases erythropoietin for red blood cells, and it triggers angiogenesis, which actually commands cells to grow brand new blood vessels directly into oxygen-starved tissues.
Wow. So that's the timeline for a lowlander moving to the mountains. But what about natural natives, like people born in the Andes or the Himalayas?
Their anatomical divergence is just remarkable. From infancy, high-altitude natives develop significantly larger chest cavities relative to their body size. Plus, the right side of their heart, the ventricle pumping blood into the lungs, is heavily hypertrophied or enlarged.
Because it's been pumping against that hypoxic pulmonary hypertension since birth.
Exactly. And the real magic is how efficiently their tissues extract oxygen. Figure 44.2 maps this out. If you picture two oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curves, the native's curve peaks much higher because they have so much more hemoglobin.
And their tissue extraction is just incredibly precise.
It really is. A native at 15,000 feet might have an arterial oxygen pressure of just 40 millimeters of mercury, which is dangerously low. Yet their venous PO2 drops by only 15 millimeters of mercury. They don't need a massive pressure gradient. Their dense capillary networks just sip exactly what they need.
which explains the data in Table 44.2 regarding work capacities at 17,000 feet. An unacclimatized person is slashed to 50% capacity. An acclimatized lowlander might hit 68%. But a native, they operate at a staggering 87% of their normal capacity.
It's an incredibly elegant system, but, homeostasis is fragile. Sometimes the human machine gets it wrong.
Right, which brings us to mountain sicknesses. Acute and chronic. Acute hits within hours or days of a rapid ascent, driven entirely by the physical shifting of fluid.
Yes, the two major killers being cerebral edema and pulmonary edema.
Brain swelling and lung flooding. So what causes the brain to swell?
When bone tissue becomes severely hypoxic, the local blood vessels instantly dilate. It's a reflex to widen the pipes and deliver more blood. But this increases capillary pressure so much that plasma physically leaks out and pulls in the cerebral tissue. The brain swells inside the rigid skull,
leading to disorientation, coma, and death. Is pulmonary edema the same mechanism?
Surprisingly, it's the exact opposite vascular response. In the systemic circulation, hypoxia causes vessels to dilate, but in the lungs, hypoxia causes pulmonary arterioles to powerfully constrict.
Hold on. Why would the lungs constrict blood flow when they are starving for oxygen?
Normally, it's a smart, localized mechanism to divert blood away from poorly ventilated areas to well-ventilated ones. But at extreme altitude, every area is poorly ventilated. So a massive number of arterioles constrict simultaneously, but unevenly.
And the right heart is still pumping furiously.
Right, forcing the entire cardiac output through a violently restricted number of open vessels. The pressure blows out the structural integrity, blasting fluid straight through the capillary walls into the alveoli. You literally drown in your own plasma.
So what does this all mean for chronic mountain sickness? Because that's not an acute failure, it's actually the body over-adapting, right?
Yeah. If you stay at altitude for years, that HIF master switch goes into overdrive. It produces too many red blood cells, your hematocrit climbs past 70 or 80%.
So it's like a factory that over-ordered raw materials. The body creates so many red blood cells that the supply trucks create a massive traffic jam. The sheer viscosity clogs the capillary roads, and the right heart destroys itself trying to pump this sludge.
That is the exact cause and effect loop. The adaptation designed to save the tissues ultimately strangles them. The pulmonary pressure gets so high that blood diverts through non-alveolar shunts, bypassing oxygen exchange entirely.
Showing how narrow the window for survival really is. Okay, let's pivot to a different extreme. What happens when we introduce too much pressure not from the air, but from gravity itself? Let's strap into a fighter jet.
Well, when an aircraft enters a tight turn, centrifugal acceleration takes over. The physics are dictated by the equation F equals mv squared over r. The faster the jet and the tighter the turn, the exponentially greater the g-force.
And positive g-force is what we feel when we're pressed down into our seat.
Correct. And the immediate threat isn't to your bones, it's your circulatory system. Under positive G, blood is centrifuged away from your head toward your lower body. Pull positive 5 Gs, and the hydrostatic pressure in the veins of your feet shoots up to nearly 300 millimeters of mercury.
So the vessels balloon outward, pooling a massive amount of blood in the legs, which means it isn't returning to the heart.
And if cardiac return drops, cardiac output drops. The heart has nothing to pump to the brain. If you look at figure 44.3, it shows blood pressure during a 3.3 G maneuver. The systolic pressure plummets from 120 down to below 22 millimeters of mercury in just seconds.
They are on the absolute brink of losing consciousness. But looking at the graph, it beautifully bounces back up to around 55 systolic.
That bounce back is the baroreceptor reflex. Pressure sensors in the carotid arteries detect that massive drop.
Oh.
They fire distress signals to the brain's vasomotor center, triggering a massive sympathetic response. Your heart rate violently accelerates and peripheral vessels clamp down, forcing blood back up to the core.
But wait, if humans pass out at 4 to 6 Gs, how do astronauts survive blastoff? Figure 44.4 shows a spacecraft launch hitting 9 Gs on the first booster, dropping, then hitting 8 Gs on the second.
It entirely depends on the direction of the force. Jets use centrifugal force, pushing blood down the vertical axis from head to toe. Spacecraft use linear acceleration. Astronauts are in semi-reclining seats, positioned transversely.
Perpendicular to the acceleration, so the force pushes them chest to back.
Exactly. Blood doesn't pool in the lower extremities, so the heart can maintain circulation to the brain, allowing them to withstand up to 11 Gs for short durations.
What about negative Gs, centrifuging blood toward the head?
That causes intense hyperepomia in the eyes. Pilots call it readout. The field of vision literally turns red from blood engorgement.
With all that pressure, why don't the brain vessels just burst?
Because the cerebrospinal fluid acts as an incredible physical buffer. As blood is centrifuged toward the skull, the CSF is centrifuged in the exact same direction, creating a high-pressure fluid cushion on the outside of the vessels that perfectly matches the soaring pressure inside.
That's amazing. And parachuting has its own brutal physics, as we mentioned. Free falling hits 175 feet per second. The parachute slows you to 20. But landing with locked knees causes a massive deceleratory force along the skeletal axis.
Which is why paratroopers use flexed knees and taut muscles as shock absorbers to dissipate the kinetic energy over a fraction of a second.
So, assuming our astronaut survives launch, they reach orbit. They're now dependent on the artificial climate of the spacecraft.
Yes, and modern spacecraft use a mixture of roughly 4 times as much nitrogen as oxygen, mimicking Earth's atmosphere.
Why carry heavy nitrogen? Why not pure oxygen?
Pure oxygen is an extreme fire hazard. Also, if a pilot breathes pure oxygen and a tiny airway gets blocked by mucus, the trapped pure O2 is rapidly absorbed into the blood. That leaves a vacuum, and the alveolus physically collapses, which is called atelectasis.
So nitrogen acts as a structural placeholder. It props the alveolus open.
Precisely. But even with a perfect atmosphere, microgravity begins dismantling the body. First, severe motion sickness, because the vestibular equilibrium centers in the inner ear have no gravity to reference.
And long-term, it triggers integrated deconditioning.
Right. Blood volume drops, cardiac output drops, and bones lose 1% of their mass per month, despite exercise.
Because bone remodeling requires physical stress, right? Gravity causes microscopic stress fractures that activate osteoblasts. Without gravity, they go dormant.
Exactly. The body stops maintaining a skeleton it doesn't think it needs, and this severely impairs the baroreceptor reflex. When astronauts return to Earth, their cardiovascular system has forgotten how to compensate for gravity. They suffer from reduced orthostatic tolerance and frequently faint when standing up.
Which is why space agencies test countermeasures, like short-arm centrifuges, to simulate G-forces for an hour a day.
And what's fascinating here is that as we plan multi-year missions to Mars, we have to consider if humans will need to artificially simulate earthly stress just to survive. Our physiology absolutely requires resistance to maintain homeostasis.
That's a profound thought to mull over. We quite literally need the weight of the world on our shoulders just to survive. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today, from the highest mountain peaks to the vacuum of space. On behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you for trusting us with your study session. Keep marveling at the incredible machinery inside you, because it is beautifully, relentlessly resilient.